Peter Attia, it is great to have you on the Next Big Idea podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Peter, you have built an unusual and extraordinary career. You're a Stanford NIH-trained physician focused on the science of longevity, as you say on your website. You have a wildly popular podcast and blog. You have a medical practice for the stars with a focus on health and longevity, and you reach a broad audience through your broader platform. Your own personal journey seems to me to be essential to the story. Here are a few salient facts, and feel free to add and subtract from this list. You were an athlete as a teenager, a boxer. You went to medical school at Stanford, then residency at Johns Hopkins. You suffered from a botched back surgery. I think it was in your 20s, which sounded pretty scary, pretty humbling. You left Johns Hopkins after growing frustrated with what you described as the culture of resistance to innovation and joined the McKinsey healthcare practice advising companies. You were the first person to make the round-trip swim from Maui to Lanai and back, which is astonishing to me, having snorkeled those waters. You found yourself, nonetheless, in your 30s with a dad bod that you say squeezed your sausage-like body into shirts, which stuck with me. You realized many of the men in your family died young, in their 40s and 50s, due to heart disease. You built this kind of highly original medical practice with a holistic long-term approach to improving health span. You've now written the #1 New York Times bestselling book, Outlive, The Science and Art of Longevity, which, as you say, is a beast of a book. I think it's 500 pages. As you put it, it's not a two-crapper. How do you think about your personal journey, and do you see the setbacks that you've encountered along the way as critical to your path and your success?
Yes, I absolutely do. And I think look, I can only comment on what I've experienced, so I can't really sort of speculate on what parallel universes look like. But I know that the path I've chosen doesn't, or maybe I should say what I'm doing today doesn't fall out neatly from any sort of traditional medical training. If someone today asks me, which I get asked all the time by people who are, in college or medical school saying, Peter, I like what you do and I want to be doing that. What's the path? It's not entirely obvious. It's probably not doing what I did. I mean, my path couldn't have been more bizarre, but it's not like there's a specialty that you would do and say, well, I want to practice medicine 3.0 as my specialty. So after medical school, I'll do this residency. And I generally say, look, probably doing internal medicine makes the most sense. But acknowledge the fact that you're going to have to do most of your learning outside of your training. You're still going to have to learn the finer points of nutrition and exercise and sleep and true prevention outside of the confines of, a medicine 2.0 system in which we're still training. And so in that sense, yes, I think whatever setbacks I had, you mentioned many of them, of course, I think I can look at every one of them now and say, actually, there's a net positive that's come from all of them, including, as much as it's hard to admit sometimes, the botched back surgery, for example. Wow. I'd probably still pay a price for that. I will for the rest of my life always be at higher risk for requiring a fusion, which is something I'd desperately like to avoid. But at the same time, that's given me, that's just given me a gift, which is an appreciation for the importance of reducing any sort of orthopedic injuries and how much your life changes when you are in a constant state of pain and immobility.
And just not taking for granted our ability to move, right? I mean, I had on a much smaller scale, I've injured my knee a couple times skiing, and I've gone through, 4 to 6 weeks on crutches of not being able to run, which I normally do daily. And it's like, it terrified me, this notion that maybe I could never run again, and changed the sense of joy that I felt. So I can only imagine that, how the more dramatic version of being truly, whenever I've had some minor back problems, and you realize how what's the word? You realize how fragile we are, right? That this with these spinal systems, and I mean we're really kind of fragile animals, and until you can very easily get all the way to 45 without realizing that, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I find so interesting about your journey is that all of us are kind of armchair scientists to some degree. I mean, it's part of our job as humans, right? Like we take the information available to us in the world and we use it to navigate as well as we can to figure out how to be healthy and happy and thrive. And we're all dealing with this sort of limitation of our own experience, the historical moment we're born into, what knowledge and resources are available to us. But we're all sort of scientific experiments of one to some degree. But it's exciting and suspenseful. And it seems to me that you, to some degree, have been on this personal journey of trying to figure out how to optimize your own health and how to flourish as a human. And you've shared that journey along the way, and you've approached it with an unusual degree of kind of rigor and intensity, right? I mean, certainly, the name of your podcast is Drive. I think that you've got a very high level of intensity that you've applied to this process, and it seems like it's almost been an organic process of people kind of watching your process of figuring out what works for you, learning about how we can improve medicine in general, and how other people at scale can benefit from that. Has that felt like an organic process?
Yeah, very much so. It certainly started out as, just trying to fix the first patient. So that would have been me. And then about, roughly 10 years ago, starting to figure out how to apply that to other patients. And our practice is very small, and that allows it to feel a bit like a laboratory where, everything is bespoke. Everything is, we just have a luxury that I don't think we would have if we were practicing this in a traditional way. And obviously that's one of the limitations that I think many doctors have, because it's not like we're doing something other doctors don't want to be doing. I've never met a doctor who isn't doing primary care, who isn't on the front lines, who doesn't say, God, like I really wish we could bring these actual tools to prevention, but the system they're in isn't really permitting it. So we feel fortunate that we can do that. And I think as an obligation, we have to be able to share that information with everybody else so that you're not just getting this information if you're Peter's patient. And that's why there's a podcast, there's a book, there's a newsletter, there's another product we've recently created called Early, which is, basically a fully digitized masterclass of everything that we do. I mean, it's, 12 modules, 30 hours of content. But I do think we have this obligation to share this so that everybody can kind of figure this stuff out on their own, and other doctors can learn what we're doing. I mean, we're not trying to be Coca-Cola here with a little secret recipe. We want everybody to know how to do this.
So you referred earlier to medicine 2.0 versus 3.0, and I think that's your term, right? I mean, that's a term that you've come up with, and I think it reflects. I mean, you described, 20 years ago, as a young resident at Johns Hopkins, you felt frustrations with the medical establishment. It sounds like some of those frustrations have persisted, and you have a pretty clear vision of how our medical system is failing us and how we can make medicine better. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, and I do think it's always helpful to start with the good, right? So, so medicine 1.0 is basically not medicine, but it was the thing that filled the void of medicine until medicine 2.0 came along, which I'll explain. But you alluded to something earlier, which is we're all armchair scientists. And I think that medicine 1.0 is what that looks like without the scientific method. So we have always constructed stories. That's why 500 years ago, we thought that there were gods that determined everything, where the planets were, why you got sick, bad odors, it was, bad humors. I mean, it was just, there was no scientific method. There was no understanding of science. You can't use a tool that has yet to be invented. And therefore, medicine 1.0 was largely witchcraft. And by the way, sometimes that witchcraft worked. It's not like it's not like a blind squirrel can't find nuts sometimes. But it didn't work because the thinking was right. It just, you happen to stumble onto things that were via alchemy that sort of tend to work. Okay. So
and there was I'm sorry to interrupt, but there was a date before which you probably didn't want to enter a hospital, right? I mean, it would be a net negative.
For sure.
And some people have put that around early 1900s. I mean, randomized controlled testing, started.
Well, yeah, certainly, certainly in the mid to late 19th century, it was problematic, right? So, if you think about, prior to antiseptic technique, prior to even local anesthetic and things like that, I mean, a hospital was a really scary place to be. But that transition where we went from the Dark Ages to where we ended up in the early 20th century, which is really when Medicine 2.0 came into its own, was a remarkable transformation, largely on the basis of three things. One being, first and foremost, the elucidation of the scientific method, a la Francis Bacon in the 17th century. And then, of course, you had germ theory, aided in large part by the development of the light microscope. And then you had the development of antibiotics. And those three things, clearly not overnight, changed the face of medicine altogether. And what they did was result in a doubling of life expectancy, and a literal doubling in life expectancy between 1900 and the year 2000. But if you look at the data closely, you'll realize that doubling in life expectancy came almost entirely through the reduction of what I describe as fast death. So, prior to that era, and up into the early 20th century, we effectively died quickly, meaning you were doing okay and then you weren't. And it was usually infections and trauma that were the cause of death. Medicine 2.0 came along and effectively solved that problem. You never make it go away, but just made it such that you weren't constantly at the threat of death. And in the process, we started to die slowly. Chronic diseases, what we'll talk about in a minute, I'm sure, the four horsemen, started to dominate the landscape. And so I don't know that I like to think of Medicine 2.0 as a failure. I just think Medicine 2.0 was designed and built around solving fast death.
Yeah.
But the playbook doesn't work for slow death. And you don't need me to tell you that. I mean, that's like obvious if you spend 10 minutes looking at the data. The approach of Medicine 2.0, which is intervening once the problem has started, doesn't really work when it comes to cancer, heart disease, neurodegenerative disease, diabetes. Furthermore, the tools of Medicine 2.0, which are largely procedural and pharmacologic, are also relatively limited when applied very late. In some cases, they're better than others. I don't want to, again, I don't want to diminish this. I mean, a person who has a heart attack today is way better off than a person who had a heart attack 50 years ago. I mean, no comparison.
Yeah.
50 years ago, if you had a heart attack, they were giving you aspirin, morphine, and oxygen. Today, they give you clot-busting drugs. They can stick a stent in. You're going to be on lipid-lowering therapy, which, of course, you should have been on 40 years earlier. But you've got way better odds. We've got AEDs. We've got advanced cardiac life support, all sorts of things. But, it's clear that this playbook is only going to produce incremental gains going forward. And therefore, we really need a new approach. And that's what I'm calling Medicine 3.0.
Yeah. And if we want evidence that the current system is failing us, I was astonished to learn that nearly, I think you say, half of Americans are diabetic or pre-diabetic.
It depends on the estimates.
Yeah.
Those are estimates that are out there. I would say the most conservative estimate would be a third.
Okay.
Yeah, so call it somewhere between a third and a half.
Yeah. And so you've identified four primary diseases that are killing us, that we are not addressing as well as we could. And you call those the four horsemen.
Right. And three of these diseases, so first off, all of these are diseases of modernity. So these are diseases that didn't really exist in appreciable quantities 100 years ago. Three of these diseases are what I call big death certificate tickets, meaning they're actually the ones that show up on the death certificates the most. And those are all of the diseases of atherosclerosis, which is heart disease and cerebrovascular disease. So heart attacks and strokes. That's number one by a country mile. Cancer. And then the entire suite of neurodegenerative diseases and dementing diseases. So that's everything from Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Lewy body dementia, etc. Vascular dementia, all these things. So those three things account for the majority of death certificates. And that's most, I mean, if you include the entire population of smokers, you have to include COPD in there. I largely exclude that from this analysis because most people who are interested in living longer aren't smoking. And therefore, so you could argue there's a fifth horseman in COPD, but for the purpose of the way I'm thinking about it, it doesn't make sense. The fourth horseman is not really a big death certificate ringer. You're not going to see him on a lot of death certificates. In fact, if you want to do the death certificate analysis, he doesn't rank in the top 5. And that's type 2 diabetes, but I expand that to include the entire spectrum of metabolic disease that is prelude to that. And that begins with hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, all the way out to type 2 diabetes. And while that spectrum of diseases, again, doesn't register at the same level as the other three horsemen, what's very important to understand is that it's the force multiplier of them all. So it's increasing your odds of each of the other three horsemen by anywhere from 50 to 100%. And so it is the insidious thing that must be controlled. You have to be metabolically healthy. That is step one of this process, right? If you want to take aim at the other three horsemen, you must address metabolic health. Your metabolic house, as I say, must be in order, and then we can begin targeting the other three in specific disease prevention strategies.
And most of us think of these diseases as something we should worry about once our doctor says, "Hey, you have a problem here." And the case you make is that the thresholds we have for when we treat these diseases are somewhat arbitrary, right? I think you say that once your risk of cardiovascular disease reaches 5% for the next 10 years, you are considered a treatment priority in the current system. But if it's 4%, even though there's a very clear pathway to future problems, it's you go to your annual checkup and they say, okay, you're fine, right? Which happens to me. I find it very frustrating. I say, can you please give me more nuance? I'm fine. What does that mean, right?
Yeah. So the threshold you're referring to is what's called major adverse cardiac events. So as you said, if your calculated risk for a major adverse cardiac event, so heart attack, stroke, or death, in the next decade is below 5%, primary prevention is not necessary, is deemed not necessary. Primary prevention means intervention to prevent your first heart attack, stroke, or brush with death. And it reminds me a lot of kind of the mortgage crisis in 2008. At the time I was at McKinsey, and even though, as you mentioned, I was recruited there to do healthcare, I ended up doing credit risk. So I spent my time in banks. And I write about this a little bit in the book because it also really, really shaped so much of my thinking. So in that sense, while it looks like a completely random and arbitrary detour out of medicine, being in the world of credit risk during what will go down in my lifetime as the greatest implosion of credit risk was very formative. Having formal training in risk management really shaped my thinking in many ways. And one of the most sobering lessons was that all models are wrong, some are useful. So in the credit models, when we first got in to look at the underbelly of these companies, and we were brought in on totally separate issues. We didn't come in because they thought mortgages were a problem. We came in to help them with compliance on something else called the Basel II Accord, which was this completely dreary, sleepy thing being levied on banks in 2006 that they couldn't care less for, but they just wanted to have, consultants figure it out for them. In playing with the models that they had built, we realized a peculiar finding, which was the models couldn't anticipate or make any prediction if home prices didn't go up. In other words, every single one of these banks' models assumed home prices would monotonically rise indefinitely. And to even try to put in a negative number for home price growth, what if home prices go down 5% in the next year? The model couldn't spit out a number. You know how that story ended.
Yeah.
On the cardiovascular side, these models can't input ages below 40. So if you took a 39-year-old with a train wreck of a situation, horrible family history, lipids out the wazoo, high blood pressure, put all the risk factors you want on them, the models won't even be able to give you a 10-year risk. Because the truth of it is, even a 39-year-old train wreck is at very low risk for a 10-year event. Now, the problem with these models is they ignore causality. In other words, when you practice medicine 3.0, you have to target causal risk factors, regardless of short-term risk. This is a very important distinction that is tragically missing from medicine 2.0. A causal risk factor, and we do it in some ways. So I'll give you an example of where medicine 2.0 does a very good job of this, but we're awful in most ways. So here's the only place, in my opinion, where medicine 2.0, not the only place, but this is the best example of medicine 2.0, treating the causal factor of risk. Nobody disputes that smoking is causally related to lung cancer.
Yeah.
We don't build dumb models that we show smokers to say, when your 10-year risk of lung cancer hits 5%, we're going to tell you to stop smoking.
Yeah.
Of course not. We know that smoking is causally related, which, by the way, doesn't mean every smoker gets lung cancer. They don't. And doesn't mean that everyone who gets lung cancer is a smoker. Causality is not a one-to-one mapping, but smoking is undoubtedly causally related. We tell people not to ever smoke. And the day somebody starts smoking, we try to get them to stop. That's a medicine 3.0 approach towards lung cancer vis-a-vis smoking. We need to be doing that for every chronic disease and every modifiable risk factor. And sadly, we don't. So, that's kind of my long spiel on one of the big distinctions between 2.0 and 3.0.
And how significant are the kind of the bad habits we can get into? We know that habit formation is an issue, but there's also the damage we potentially do to our bodies in our starting potentially as early as our teenage years into our 20s and 30s and 40s. In college, I had a friend whose father was a physician, and his advice to his son was, you know what, kid, go out, have a great time, party, smoke, drink, do whatever you want. Then when you turn 40, clean up your act, become a health nut, because most of these conditions are reversible. I guess you would disagree with that advice?
I would, yeah, on several reasons, right? So one, you're doing a lot of damage to yourself when you're 20 and 30. That's, the analogy to me there would be telling somebody when they graduate from college and get their first job at 22, don't save a penny, don't plan for retirement, accumulate as much debt as you can, and then when you're 40, start thinking about things responsibly. There's a grain of truth to this, right? You should enjoy yourself when you're young and you can. I mean, I fully, buy this idea. I don't know if you've read Bill Perkins' book, Die with Zero. It's a fantastic book. I've had Bill on the podcast, and, in it, Bill talks about the importance of spending money while you can spend money. But that's not incongruent with also being responsible and planning for, the future. So on the one level, I just sort of reject that. And then the other level is, to your point, like, it's really hard to break horrible habits. The third reason I reject that advice is I reject the advice that being healthy and making healthy choices is only beneficial for the future. In fact, this is where the analogy with savings is actually not a good analogy. Yeah. Because there's no question that when you're saving money today, it's a net negative today. You don't get anything out of not spending that $200 a week that you're putting into your 401k. So it's 100% downside today. And you're just sort of trying to arbitrage the hyperbolic discounting function that tells you it's going to be worth even more tomorrow. But with health, it's actually beneficial tomorrow and today. You're going to feel better when you're 30 if you're eating reasonably, not drinking excessively, and you're fit. So even if by some miracle at 40 you could turn that ship around, and I would argue it's very difficult to do so, and you're not going to erase all the damage, you've also spent 2 decades not feeling as good as you could feel. Yeah. So again, you don't have to be a monk. That's certainly not what I'm suggesting. I'm not suggesting that, we be little robots who are purely optimized around health and no optimization around joy or pleasure. But obviously, I think that the advice is extreme.
Yeah. Yeah. You have this, this really interesting kind of counterintuitive framing around thinking about our health, working our way backwards, asking the question, in your last decade of life, what do you want to be able to do? Right. And you call this the centenarian decathlon, and work your way backwards to, based on what you want to do in your 90s, or if you're so fortunate to live that long, you're going to have to start making investments now in that 401k, as you say. You're going to have to change your behaviors now to be able to lift your bag, and put it in the slot in front of you in the airplane, pick up your great grandkids, carry groceries. Do you want to share that logic?
Yeah, it's I think a lot through this lens of what's called the marginal decade. So it's one of the first questions I'll ask a new patient is, what are your goals for the last decade of your life? And what are your goals for the next 12 months? That's how we frame our time together. And how do we make those congruent? So almost without exception, nobody's goals line up. So I don't know if you've ever done archery, but in archery, with a compound bow, you have like a peep, which is the thing that's right in front of your eye. It's in the string when you draw back. Yeah. And then you have a sight at the end of the bow, and you have to line those two up perfectly. If there's even the smallest eclipse, your arrow is going to deviate wildly. So you have to have what's called front sight, rear sight acquisition perfectly before you release the arrow. And that's how I sort of think of it. That's your 1-year goal. That's your marginal decade goal. They have to line up. Now, most people have far too lofty a set of goals in their marginal decade for what they're doing today. So you ask people, and we do this quite formally eventually, not in the first meeting, but eventually we do this quite formally where we actually have a list of 50 things and we say, pick the 10 that are most important to you. Mm-hmm. And they're activities of daily living. They can be, very particular things to an individual. Lots of people who ski want to be able to ski when they're in the last decade of their life. And we're not here to tell them that that's an unreasonable goal. We're simply here to tell them what is the physiologic requirement to be able to do that. And then we know what the rate of decline is of these metrics. So we know how much strength declines by decade. We know how much power declines by decade. We know how much VO2 max declines by decade. So we say, well, these are the physiologic requirements for where you want to be at 90. Based on how they're declining, this is where you need to be today. Where are you? Oh, you're here. So you're higher than where you need to be at 90, but you're not nearly high enough. Yeah. So it's sort of like saying, I'm in a glider and I want to get over here, and I'm only here. And it's like, no, your glider's not going to make it. Yeah. But the sooner you find that out, the more time you have to get that glider back up. And that's effectively what the exercise is all about.
That I love this notion of aging as a glide path. I hadn't thought of it that way. And you have this list of like, do you want to be able to hike 1.5 miles on a hilly trail? Would you like to be able to have sex? Would you like to be able to open a jar? Right. And I think you said that most all of your patients say, actually, I'd like to be able to do all of those things. And they typically have a few others. I'd like to be able to dance at jazz festival in New Orleans. I'd like to ski, play tennis, But as you say, given the glide path of what we know, we can be pretty darn confident that our capabilities will erode at a certain clip. It's very eye-opening. And I wonder whether it's interesting because it's a perspective that had never occurred to me. And I wonder if that year you spent on your back or a portion of it on your back, being unable to do the most basic things, was part of what enabled you to think about what it feels like to be 95. This sense that we have to fight for this kind of basic mobility.
Yeah, it absolutely was. I have a really good friend, Rick Elias, who has also been on my podcast. Rick was one of the people who was on that U.S. Air flight that Captain Sullenberger landed in the Hudson in 2009. And Rick has given one of the most powerful, moving TED Talks you'll ever hear. It's very short. It's about 7 minutes long, where he talks about that experience. I would recommend everybody stop listening to this podcast right now. Go listen to that 7-minute TED Talk, and then you can come back. And in it, he talks about what a gift it was, because it was inevitable that they were going to die. There's nobody on that plane who thought, we're coming out of this one. It was, it was 90 seconds of, wow, this is it. This is over. And Rick talks about that in a way that's really remarkable. But what's also amazing to me is how he says, this has been the greatest gift I've ever received. Because when you get someone to take you to the end of your life, so you get to live, you get to see what exactly goes through your mind as you're dying. And then they snap your fingers and you're back and you get to do it all over again. What a gift. And so on a much smaller scale, I think that's exactly what I experienced at the age of 27, which was 3 months of not being able to walk. So just being, just laying on a floor for 3 months. My mom had to come down and literally feed me, for a year being incapacitated with pain. And that's a long enough period of time that you don't forget it. I've said this before, but my kids get a kick out of the fact that if we pull into a strip mall, like I'm going to park as far away as possible just to celebrate that I love that I can walk in. I don't care if it's raining. I don't care how hot it is. I don't care how many other parking spots are closer. Let's walk, because it's awesome to be able to walk, which I couldn't, right? So total gift. And I don't know that I would want everybody to experience what I went through, but maybe if they can take my word for it.
Yeah, exactly. The deathbed perspective. If the Lord wants to make a man happy, he takes away his donkey and then gives it back to him. I always like that. Okay, so we know that we have, a few levers that we can pull to achieve our health objectives, right? And we know that the big three are diet, sleep, and exercise. Mental health is also really important, and we'll talk about that. But among the physical things we can do, if you had to force rank those three levers, diet, sleep, and exercise, what do you think are the ones that are most effective in improving the health span of most people listening? How would you rank those three?
It's no question that exercise is number one. There should be no debate on that. I'm actually surprised there is. There is, by the way, but that's just because I think most people aren't familiar with the data. And I also think nutrition is so tribal and religious that people tend to get very personally attached to nutrition. And so there's just a lot of weirdness there. But there is no debate. That exercise is the heavyweight champion of all things that pertain to a longer, better life. And I'll explain why in a moment. As far as nutrition and sleep, I would generally put nutrition second, sleep third, but there's a caveat here, which is if your sleep is really, really bad, it could catapult to number one in the short run. Sure. And I would also say that there are examples I've seen, and I know people. I mean, I have a person who's in my life who, a friend whose sleep is so bad that it actually undoes any benefit on the nutrition and exercise in her life. And she understands it. We actually spoke earlier this week, and I'm like, I mean, 4 hours a night of sleep is just not sufficient.
Yeah.
And it is tearing you apart. And here's all the evidence why, right? But as a general rule, I would go exercise, nutrition, sleep. But the gap between exercise and the other two is a chasm. And here's the data, right? So the easiest way to imagine this is to ask the question, what are the gradations of improvement or harm that come in the extreme states of each? So let's start with nutrition. What is nutrition all about? Nutrition is all about metabolic health. So what is the most extreme state of poor nutrition? It's type 2 diabetes and obesity. So how much of a risk does that bring to an individual? And if you look at all the Cox proportional hazards, which are the statistical tools that we use to generate what are called hazard ratios, it's clear that the risk of type 2 diabetes is significant. We talked about it earlier.
Yeah.
It's, anywhere from 30, 50, in some cases. Well, if you talk about all-cause mortality, it's about 30 to 50% more. And if you talk about disease-specific mortality, it can be 50 to 100% more. But let's just talk about all-cause mortality, because that's the number that matters most. This is death from anything. This includes infections, you name it. And let's say 1.4 to 1.5 is the hazard ratio. To me, that speaks to just how important nutrition is. Nutrition is a very important tool for maintaining energy balance and metabolic health. And when that's out of whack, that's how much of a hit you take. Okay. When you look at sleep deprivation or disrupted sleep, it has smaller hazard ratios than that. You're in the sort of 1.2 range to 1.3 range. So short sleep is going to come with a 20 to 30% increase in all-cause mortality. By the way, long sleep does too, probably because long sleep reflects fragmented sleep, but it may also underpin diseases. There may be some bias within that system because you may be sleeping long because of underlying disease. But now let's look at exercise. In exercise, we have 3 really good metrics that integrate the work that is done. And those are VO2 max, muscle mass, and strength. And I use the term integrator, which is probably foreign to people because we're not used to thinking about, calculus when we think about health. But for anybody who's taken calculus, and they'll remember what an integral function is. An integral function is a function that adds up the area under the curve. And so in physical systems, we think of this as the work that has been done. And your glucose level, if you woke up tomorrow and I checked your glucose level, that's not a great integrator of what's been happening over the past few months or years. A hemoglobin A1C is a little bit better, right? A hemoglobin A1C integrates or tells me, roughly speaking, over the past 3 months, what has your blood glucose looked like? But the actual blood glucose doesn't really tell me all that much. You could have had perfect blood glucose, but then the night before you just ate like crazy, and it's not going to look that great. But VO2 max, like there's nothing you could have done in the last day or week that is going to significantly, if your number is high, it's not high because of what you did over a day or a week or a month. It's high because of an enormous volume of training you've done. Similarly, if it's low, it's not because you had a bad night last night. It's low because you are deconditioned. The same is true for muscle mass, and the same is true for strength. These are huge integrators of work. And the differences between people who are high and low in those metrics dwarfs anything you see for nutrition and sleep. So if you have a very high VO2 max versus a very low VO2 max, so let's just say if you compare people in the bottom 25% for their age and sex to the top 2.5%, the difference is 5x, which is a 400% difference in all-cause mortality.
Astonishing.
If you talk about bottom decile or bottom quartile strength to top quartile strength, it's a hazard ratio of almost 3. That's nearly 200% difference. The same is true for muscle mass. So what would I take away from that? If your VO2 max, muscle mass, and strength are in the top 10% for your age and sex, I mean, you're bulletproof in terms of, like, your nutrition doesn't really matter that much. You could,
Wow.
So they talk, now again, there's a caveat here, because you wouldn't be able to get into that shape without reasonable nutrition and sleep to support it. So, there is an absolute cross-pollination of these things.
Sure.
But this type of analysis is what makes it so abundantly clear why, does my 17-chapter book have 3 chapters more than anything else devoted to exercise? There's no other topic that garners so much discussion and instruction, because it is the most important tool that we have. And that is obviously inclusive of all pharmacologic agents.
I mean, the magnitude of this difference is kind of astonishing. And I was unaware of this before reading your book, that I believe that smoking creates something like a 40% increase in the probability of dying from
That's right.
lung cancer.
Smoking
right?
is about, no. So smoking's increases your risk of dying from lung cancer by 900%.
Okay.
However, the impact of smoking on all-cause mortality is 40 to 50%.
40 to 50%. So if it's 40%, whereas the difference between, as you just said, I think top 2.5% VO2 max versus bottom quartile is 400%. So literally, like, if you take somebody who's sedentary and say, okay, you can continue to be sedentary, not get much exercise, or we can train you to get at the top of your VO2 max potential and take up smoking versus not smoke and continue to be sedentary, you'd be better off smoking a pack a day.
It's hard to know without doing the experiment, but yes, the numbers would suggest that. And by the way, a lot of people will hear us say this and say, come on, you guys are clowns. Like, who's going to get into the top 2.5%?
Sure.
Which I would say, well, first of all, I do believe most people can, and I've seen it because we do it with our patients, but let's put that aside. It doesn't need to be that great. Let's go from being in the bottom 25th percentile into the third quartile. So let's just divide the population into bottom 25th, 25th to 50, 50 to 75, 75th to 100. Like, that's, if you go from the very bottom to just the third one, there's not a human being on this planet who is incapable of doing that with a little bit more training. That reduction in risk, that difference in risk that's a hazard ratio of about 2.75. That's 175% difference in all-cause mortality in any given year. So you don't have to be talking about the most extreme difference.
Yeah, the gap in perception here is so enormous. I think if I were to survey my friends, I think most of them would think that nutrition was more important than exercise.
Absolutely, I think it's what most people. I think most people believe that, and yeah, that's why I just sort of I have a friend and we joke a lot about this on Twitter, which is there should be. I wish there was a way that Twitter wouldn't let you tweet anything nutrition related until you do 10 push-ups. Like, you just, you got to go out and run half a mile. Then you can come and pontificate about your nutrition. If you didn't work out today for an hour, no nutrition tweeting.
Yeah, I think a push-up requirement for tweeting just in general might be great. It's probably a good idea. But I think you said that you yourself 10 years ago did not understand how much more powerful exercise was for our health. And at the time you saw diet as maybe the biggest driver.
Absolutely. Yep. I was privy to this fallacy as well up until, probably about 6 years ago, I would say.
Yeah. And this is really, I think, great news and should hopefully listeners receive this. I mean, maybe the first response is, oh no, I've got to get off my ass and get to the gym, which is true. but the good news is we just had Kelly McGonigal on the show, who gave a great TED talk about. She's a social psychologist, wrote a book called The Joy of Movement. That we have this beautiful cocktail of neurochemicals that reward us for moving our bodies. Right, we get this release of endorphins and endocannabinoids and myokines, which scientists call hope molecules. We feel more optimistic. We connect better with other humans. We have better brain function. So, as you say, I mean, we get these incredible kind of short-term dividends from exercise as well as sleep, for that matter, and nutrition, and then these incredibly profound long-term health benefits. So it's really kind of a no-brainer. And I thought up until reading your book, Peter, that I was like had a great fitness program, and now I know I've got to double down. It's not enough. And we'll get to some of those details. But is that I mean, you would
everything you said is completely accurate, and I agree with exactly that point. And I think I describe it at some point in the book as exercise is the single most important drug we have.
Yeah, right. If it were a pill, imagine how valuable it would be.
Well, it's funny. Everybody wants to come up with the exercise pill, and I get pitched on it about every week, right? So there's always some biotech company that, or some lab that says they've discovered this is the one molecule that's conferring all the benefits of exercise. And we've got this mouse model that demonstrates if you just infuse them with this molecule, you're going to get benefits. But the truth of it is that's never going to pan out. And the reason is there's too many things going on. That's what makes exercise so remarkable, is it is hitting so many different systems that it can't be put into a pill. So as an intervention, it has no peer. That's the good news. The bad news is you do have to do a little bit of good work. The next piece of good news is, to your point, you get all these incredible benefits in real time, and they just keep paying dividends in the long run.
And is it counteracting each of the four horsemen? I mean, I think it does impact, doesn't it? Glucose disposal, insulin sensitivity, growth factors for neurons.
It's the single biggest needle mover on neurodegenerative disease. It's the single biggest needle mover on metabolic disease. Cancer is less clear, where there's no doubt that it reduces the risk of cancer, if for no other reason, through its impact on metabolic disease. And poor metabolic health is the second biggest driver of cancer after smoking. And on cardiovascular disease, it's hard to force rank it, because cardiovascular disease has so much genetics involved, and that just necessitates the use of pharmacotherapy. So it really depends on the individual. In other words, you can be the fittest person in the world, but if your Lp(a) is through the roof, or you have familial hypercholesterolemia, you're going to need lots of drugs to address that problem. So I wouldn't be able to say in that person's case, exercise is the most important thing. I would say, pharma is, but clearly for two of the four, exercise is hands down the most important. And for the other two, it is important, but the relative weighting is going to depend on the individual.
Yeah. Okay. And so getting into the nuts and bolts, what do we need to do to get these extraordinary benefits? What do you recommend for your typical individual in a given week?
So I usually start with the question of how much time are you willing to give to this process, right? I don't want to sort of, people always say, well, Peter, what do you do? And it's like, that's not relevant what I do, right? Tell me what you're willing to do, and we will work with that. And by the way, the math is pretty much the same for everybody. It's take whatever that number is, divide it in half. Half of that is going to be strength and stability. Half of that is going to be cardio. The strength stability should be divided such that about 80% of it is strength, 20% of it is stability. The cardio should be divided such that about 80% of it is zone 2 and 20% of it is VO2 max specific training. That, in a nutshell, is the simplest formula for how to divide your time in exercise. And again, is that going to get you the fastest marathon time? No. Is that going to help you win the local time trial series if you're a cyclist? No, not at all, right? Like, so I'm not for a second suggesting that this is the most sport-specific way to train. I'm telling you this is the best way to train if you're trying to become a centenarian decathlete.
And so to put a finer point on it, let's say I'm 55. And let's say in my 90s, knock on wood, I'd like to be able to do everything on the list, including dance at the jazz festival in New Orleans and ski and play squash. I have historically been more focused on cardio. One of the big learnings for me reading your book is how important strength training is, which I knew I needed to start doing more of due to sort of strengthening bones and dealing with muscle atrophy as we age. But I'll very briefly give you my current workout regime, because I've been optimizing, Peter, for time efficiency as a busy person.
And that's totally fine. Yeah.
So my typical 4 days a week, I go out. I used to run 2 or 3 miles, but I've gotten it down to I've added sprints. And so I run about 2 miles with 6 all-out 45-second sprints. It used to be, I'd like to get that higher. I've been gradually increasing the length of time of the sprints. But that takes 15 minutes, to run 2 miles with 6 all-out sprints. And so that's 4 days a week. 2 days a week, I play squash for an hour, which is more intensive cardio, I think, more sustained. On the weekends, I'll do like a 3 to 4 mile longer run, and then I do, like, twice a week, I do minimal strength training, basically curls and benches. I know I need to do more now, so that's a start. What do you say?
So how many hours does that add up to? And like on those 2 mile sprint days, are you doing a warm up, cool down? Or like, how are you preparing yourself for those all out efforts?
I'm really not. Actually, after each sprint, I walk it off for 30 seconds. But okay. I tend to. I don't do a whole lot of warm up and cool off. I've never been a big stretcher, but although I realize maybe I need to modify that plan. But I think it adds up to all in, 3 hours and change a week. Okay. Of exercise, roughly.
Okay. And are you willing to do any more?
I'm totally willing to do more. I wanna have sex in my 90s.
Okay. So let's just throw a number out there and say 6 hours a week total exercise.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
Okay. So how would I think about that in you? Well, again, this is very generic. This would be all modifiable based on knowing your metrics. So once I saw your VO2 max, saw your zone 2 output, I'm going to assume you'd fail our strength test miserably. And that's because most people do, even people who come at it with a strength training background. So there's not, I'm not saying that to be critical.
It's not because you can see me on video. That's not.
No, not at all. It's just that, like, the test is very, very hard and the standards are very, very high because we're building the test. Our metrics are set such that everybody could do everything at 90. That's the standard we're going to hold you to. And that's why virtually everybody fails at 40. So I would say that means you're going to be doing strength training for 3 hours a week. And we would focus on some movement preparation. So we would first do a movement assessment. That movement assessment would probably demonstrate some very classic patterns, I would suspect. So I suspect you're very tight in the hamstrings. I would have to look at your breathing patterns and stuff like that. But as you recall, I write about this in the book, right? There are these sort of 3 different archetypes of breathing patterns, and those breathing patterns largely dictate your movement strategies. Your movement strategies, all of those movement strategies are counterproductive and they need to be corrected. So you'd spend 20% of that 3 hours on exercises to correct the movement patterns, and the remaining 80% of time strength training. Because you don't have a huge background in strength training, we're not going to get too fancy. It would probably be 3 whole body workouts a week. We're not going to do an upper lower split. We're also not going to, we're going to start you doing a lot of single leg exercises. This is very important for runners. So, running is a single leg activity, right? Each leg is doing it, is impacting forceful on its own and receiving force on its own. So you're not, a squat and a deadlift are kind of not natural exercises in that sense to a runner. So you're going to be learning a lot of new exercises, mostly variations of split squats, single leg RDLs, things like that. So these are much safer exercises as well for somebody who doesn't come into this with a huge background of strength training. On the cardio side, what are we going to do? Well, the good news is you've already got an awesome base there. I think what we're going to do is widen the base of your pyramid, because right now, just on what you described, you got a little too much peak intensity, not enough base building. Yeah. So of that 3 hours, I actually want 80% of that to be at zone 2, which is an intensity at which you can run and still carry out a conversation. And given your level of fitness, that's still going to be probably a decent clip. You're probably, I'm guessing, but that might be like, 8-minute miles for you or something like that. Yeah. It has to be brisk enough that there's a training effect. So if you can talk easily, that's actually too low in intensity. If you can't talk at all, which obviously you can't during a lot of your higher intensity stuff, then that's too much. So 80% of those miles are going to be run right at that zone 2 level. And then the other 20%, I'm actually going to take you back to intervals, but they're going to be longer intervals. So we're going to really optimize around around VO2 max. And so what I'd probably have you do, depending on how fast you are, is do 3-minute intervals. So I'd have you go as hard as you can for 3 minutes, walk for 3 minutes, as hard as you can for 3 minutes, walk for 3 minutes. And we'll push that up to 4. And you only do that once a week. So you'll do... And that's going to be the toughest workout you do a week, both in the weight room or on the track. That one workout, we would optimize the other workouts around that one being your highest performance workout a week. We would structure your rest around that. We would structure everything around you being able to give it your all and leave it on the table for that one workout.
And so I'm guessing the reason that you had that your answer to the question, what's the optimal workout, is sort of about the time that a typical person listening to this can allocate, is probably because there are many people who would think 6 hours of working out a week, that's a non-starter, right?
Yep.
And we know that there's the opportunity for a virtuous cycle here, partly because of what we described about the great joy of how good you feel when you exercise. So really what we want to do is get people on a kind of virtuous cycle of exercising more and more and more. And would you say that it sounds like you probably work out even more than what you just described, more than 6 hours a week? I mean, would you say that the average person should be getting on a pathway to incrementally increase their both cardio and strength training up until they get to a kind of a total of 6 hours or more?
Again, I don't think of it that way. I think,
yeah.
I mean, again, the data show that there is no upper limit to the benefit that comes from increased fitness, increased muscle mass, increased strength, especially increased cardio fitness. We see no upper bound to that limit. This is kind of unusual in biology, right? Most things in biology are use and upside down use. Most of biology is the Goldilocks principle. Cardiorespiratory fitness is an exception to that rule. It's one of the exceptions. So, I think that everything you said before is correct. And when we start with people who don't exercise at all, we just peg them at 3 hours a week, because that increment alone provides the biggest improvement that you'll see from any 3 hour addition. So going from completely sedentary to 3 hours a week of exercise will reduce your risk of all-cause mortality by 50%. So
wow.
That's a staggering improvement. And if I never get you to take another step beyond those 3 hours a week, we've still won the game. But you're exactly right. Virtually without exception, those people 6 months later, 9 months later are like, this is freaking awesome. I want to do more of this.
Yeah. And you've seen this in your practice, like
right.
with patients over and over again. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm getting stronger. My aches and pains are actually going away. Counterintuitive, right? They sort of had this thing, which is, I'm going to kind of coddle myself, my aches and pains. I'm going to do less. And the reality of it is there's nothing that's better for reducing chronic pain than exercising safely. Now, look, everything comes with a nuance here. Can you exercise too much? Absolutely. Can any amount of exercise, if done incorrectly, increase long-term risk? Absolutely. But again, the luxury I think we have is we have the ability to sort of be nuanced and thoughtful in our approach. So I wouldn't I mean, it's a broader discussion, of course, but whether 6 hours is the right number for you, or 7 hours or 8 hours or 10 hours, is a function of what else it's competing with. And that doesn't just include other activities such as, attention to your nutrition or work, but it includes other things that are equally important, such as your relationships and connection to other people. By the way, the one thing I didn't address in your question is, where does the racquetball and stuff fit in? I would not include that in the 6 hours. So the 6 hours is dedicated to training. Racquetball is a sport. That's an activity. That's part of why you train, is to be able to do that. So I would just say the 6 hours I would like from you to be the training, and then, play your sports, your tennis, racquetball, whatever outside of it. And by the way, you'll be better at those things as well, and your risk of injury will be lower.
Yeah. And how many hours a week are you exercising?
So I'm at kind of a low number by my standards now, in part because of the book and just other things that are a huge demand on my time. I'm trying to think. I'm probably at 10 hours a week right now. I think for me, the sweet spot's about 14. I think I perform at my best and feel my best at about 14 hours per week. So I'm kind of undertrained at the moment, and a little bummed out about it. But you also have to keep in mind, like, I have a much different training age than most people. I mean, up until my early 40s, I was training over 20 hours a week. Right. And there were periods of my life as a teenager, which is really when I think you lay a lot of the foundation in the muscle. I mean, I was training 36 to 40 hours a week as a teenager, from about the age of 13 to 19. So,
and this was as a young boxer, and then subsequently as a swimmer, setting new records, swimming 32 kilometers.
Yeah, and as a cyclist later on. So there's always been something that has been very high volume training, and I'll never go back to that volume. I don't pine for that at all. And actually, in some ways, what I'm enjoying now is the mental act of trying to be more flexible in my thinking, and acknowledging that there's a season for everything, and right now is not the season for me to be absolutely crushing it in every workout, and learning how to read my body a little bit more. And so again, I don't think I'm necessarily the person you should be saying, okay, well, whatever Peter does, I'm going to do, because that's not necessarily necessary.
And I think there are ways to work the exercise into our lives. I mean, I walk a fair amount living in New York City, and ride bicycles a fair amount, although the new electric bikes are very tempting. It's a problem for me. But I was very interested in rucking, which is something which is basically walking or hiking with a weighted backpack up to a third of your body weight. I actually purchased the first step kind of inexpensive rucking system, which is a series of sandbags that I could fill before I go to the $350 full rucking system. But I like the idea that I could go to pick up my kid at school, about 1.5 miles walk and back, 3 miles round trip, listen to audiobooks, podcasts, which is part of my work, right? I mean, there are ways of integrating this into your life such that it's not a zero-sum game of like, not being able to accomplish the other things you want to do.
Yep.
I think one of the things that to me was most surprising about your exercise suggestions is the amount of strength training. And so for your typical listener, I mean, this is, I imagine, as important for women as it is for men. I mean, you don't tend to in the gyms, you don't tend to see women in the moving weights around as often as men do. I mean, it seems if you were to speak to what is most misunderstood about the benefits of exercise, I think cardio is more broadly appreciated as something that's really good for us. It seems like the strength training might be the piece that is not as widely understood.
Yeah, cardio has all of these amazing metabolic benefits. It's by far the most important tool we have to increase insulin sensitivity. And insulin sensitivity, meaning the ability of the muscles to be receptive to the signal of insulin to bring glucose out of the circulation into the muscle, is an absolute hallmark of avoiding or delaying death. And cardio training has no peer in that regard. But what strength training does is partially factor into that. you see strength training increases the capacity of the muscle as a reservoir for glucose. So a bigger muscle, all things equal, is a bigger sink for glucose.
Interesting.
So you get all these benefits metabolically. You also get many of the same, chemical benefits that you're getting, the endocrine benefits, the cognitive benefits that you're getting from cardio training. But where strength training is imperative and where it has no peer is on the structural side. And this is with respect to bone density and strength. And those two things decline so much when we age, especially in women. So women are more susceptible to this because of hormone loss. That, if we were ever going to add another horseman to the list, it would be accidental death, of which falling is the biggest cause of accidental death in the person over 65. So that's a very close competitor for a fifth horseman. Once you're over 65, if you fall and in the course of that fall break your hip or your femur, there's a 15 to 30% chance you will be dead in 12 months.
It's astonishing.
Worth repeating. It's so staggering. If you're over 65 and you fall and break your hip or femur, there's a 15 to 30% chance, depending on the study, you're not going to be alive in a year. And of the people who are still alive in a year, 50% of them will never regain complete movement. So even if you're lucky enough to live, you're debilitated for life. You have lost some critical capacity. So it's just hard to overstate this. And my kind of glib way that I explain this to patients who are somewhat resistant is, all right, so I don't know what the estimate is for how many billion people have lived, but I think it's 20 billion people we think have lived in all of human history. So I just said, just give me an estimate, just ballpark for me. Of those 20 or 30 billion or whatever the number is, how many of them do you think in the last year of their life said, I wish I had less muscle mass? What do you think that number is? I'll tell you what it is. 0. 0 times is how many times in human history someone in the last year of their life said, I wish I had less muscle mass. It's simply not possible. You can't have too much muscle at the end of your life.
So interesting. And what do you think about, I have been under the impression that ultra marathon runners die earlier, that there's such a thing as too much cardio, and that when you see crazy jacked, bodybuilders, that bodybuilders die a bit earlier. That might be partly.
I think those are both probably true. So again, the crazy jacked bodybuilder is probably dying not from how much muscle he has, but from what he had to do to get that much muscle. I've actually, sat down with a number of these guys, and I'm not being judgmental. I'm just insanely curious about what they need to do to get there. Most people, I think, look at, bodybuilders and think, well, they're just kind of freaks and they just take a bunch of drugs. And yeah, they are genetic freaks. And yeah, they take a bunch of drugs, but they're training and eating like you can't believe it. So there's nothing really healthy about anything they're doing. And the amount of drugs that they're taking is legion. I mean, it's, just to give you some numbers, if we're replacing testosterone in a male patient, a typical dose is 50 milligrams of testosterone twice a week. So 100 milligrams a week is pretty much a physiologic replacement. There are some patients that need a little bit more. I don't think I've ever given a patient more than 140 milligrams of testosterone in a week. I had breakfast with a bodybuilder a while ago, and he's not even a pro. He's not even a famous bodybuilder. He's just a guy who does this. And I was just picking his brain, what are your testosterone cycles like? His lowest is 1,000 milligrams a week.
Wow.
There are some weeks that he has taken. Now, I don't think this is representative. I think this guy's probably just such an outlier. There are some weeks he said he took 25,000 milligrams of testosterone.
Good God.
But, taking 6, 7, 800 to 1,000 milligrams of testosterone a week, plus growth hormone, plus insulin, plus all of these other crazy hormones. I mean, I would argue that that's playing a greater role in their demise than the actual amount of muscle. Not to mention the way they're eating. I just don't think it's healthy to be, moving, just putting that much mass on. So I don't, I always want to make sure people don't use the excuse of the 300-pound bodybuilder dies prematurely, therefore I shouldn't lift weights. No, that's the wrong interpretation. Similarly, you're right. I think, obviously, Chris McDougall wrote that book, Born to Run, and there's the very famous example of the protagonist of that book who did die, and probably died from either a cardiomyopathy or an electrical failure of the heart due to the heart getting stretched out a little bit. We do see a slightly higher incidence of atrial fibrillation and cardiomyopathy in people who are exercising very, very excessively. But again, I find it a little disconcerting when people who are couch potatoes use those people as the counterexample to why they don't want to do it. So I'm more than happy to talk to the patient who's doing 90 miles a week of running and get them to back off. I'm happy to have that discussion. But yeah, it shouldn't be used as the excuse to not do it. For 99.99999% of people, they don't even have the capacity to push as hard as those two extremes are pushing, and they shouldn't worry about it.
I can assure you, Peter, this is not a risk for me. There's no ultramarathon or bodybuilding excessive risk for me. I'm a little disappointed that you're not giving me credit for my squash and tennis workouts in my 6 hours, but we'll get to that later.
And again, I love that you're doing that because I think that play is important, right? And I think that type of stuff is great. The reason I think it's hard for me to put it in your 6 hours is the sweet spot around exercise is when you control the energy system, and not the problem, but the difficulty of doing that in any sort of sport like squash or tennis is it's very up and very down, right? So your training effect
it's interval training.
But it's not just interval training. It's inconsistent interval training where you're never at a high enough intensity for long enough to get the true VO2 max building, and you're never low enough for long enough to get the plateau or the aerobic base building. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. But if we're truly trying to optimize your energy systems around long-term things, we want to be able to train in a very specific way. So specificity is very important. Again, it's not an accident that I've called it the centenarian decathlon. A decathlete is generally regarded as the best athlete overall, but they're not the best at any one thing. So they're a generalist who's very good at a bunch of things, never the best, but think about the specificity with which that athlete has to train to accomplish that feat. So it really is kind of a, I used to refer to it as the centenarian Olympics when I first started talking about this 5-6 years ago, but I realized that the centenarian decathlon is a much better mental model. Yeah,
interesting. Well, on the topic of controlling energy cycles, that could be a good segue to sleep, which for me is a great topic because it feels like a relatively easy win. I guess we don't want to use the term easy because for many people I know sleep is, for many of us, sleep is a real issue. But the benefits that I felt in my own life when I decided to just allocate more time to the sleeping process and get a little bit disciplined about trying to get good sleep, it just feels good, right? And I think it's an easier way perhaps to feel a lot better and get some real benefits. Would you agree with that?
I do. I echo your sentiments completely, which is nothing's easy, but this one has the shortest gap between decision and execution. So for each of these things, whether it be nutrition, emotional health, exercise, sleep, the first and most important step is the committed step. You have to decide you want to do this. None of this happens by accident. You're not just going to kind of, oh my God, accidentally, like my VO2 max is so high. No. You got to decide, like, I want a high VO2 max. I want to be strong. I want to be, et cetera. When it comes to fully embracing the decision to optimize your sleep, which is the hardest step, once you do that, the path to doing it is by far the easiest of any intervention we have.
Yes, right. Yeah.
But that's a big first step.
And the dividends are, I mean, it profoundly affects mood, cognitive function, glucose removal, memory formation, libido, empathy, right?
Yeah, it's really wonderful. It's definitely the easiest thing that we work on in the practice. And it doesn't mean that it's easy. And it doesn't mean that there aren't patients who we don't send for CBTI, so cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which, some people who, after we pull all the levers, fix all of the underlying, hygiene issues, rule out medical issues such as sleep apnea, they're still struggling with insomnia. Yeah, I mean, there's some really important and wonderful behavioral tools that you can do. But I've never seen I've yet to see a patient who doesn't resolve with CBTI when we have to go down that rabbit hole. But you have to get to this point where you're saying, this is so important that I'm willing to do it, which means I'm willing to make 8 hours of my day for this thing. And, that's about what it takes to get 7.5 hours, 7:15 to 7.5 hours of sleep. You got to be able to devote 8 to 8.5 hours to this activity.
Yeah.
I'm going to be consistent when I go to bed and when I wake up, including weekends. The room is going to be dark. It's going to be cold, and I'm not going to have electronics in the room. You got to get the phone out of the room.
Yep.
Just no phone in the room. And you got to set the mood for sleep by not doing stimulating things beforehand. And the most notable of these for virtually every human being is email and social media. So, people say, oh, Peter, does that mean you can't watch TV before bed? No, not at all. I mean, a lot of times you're watching TV, it's kind of like more relaxing, enjoyable. It probably isn't the optimal thing to do, but no one's saying you can't just, sit there and watch some TV before bed, but you want to make sure you don't fall asleep on the couch if you're doing it too. So, again, there's lots of ways to work through it. And then there are a lot of supplements that I think really help and are great for optimization that aren't, habit forming and don't come with a lot of the negative health consequences of traditional sleep medications such as Ambien and Lunesta.
Interesting. So what supplements do you like?
So, what I personally use is I use 3 grams of glycine, 600 milligrams of ashwagandha, magnesium L-threonate. I take, those are kind of the big ones. I take a few other things before bed, but that's not because they're aiding with sleep. It's just like, for example, EPA and DHA, I'm spreading out between morning and evening. I feel like there's something else I'm blanking on. That might be it. And I also use, depending on, like, for example, like I'm traveling to Europe this summer for a week to do some book stuff, and I'm all about kind of maximum efficiency when I travel. So if I'm going somewhere for 6 days, even if it's a 7 or 8 hour time zone difference, I don't want to waste any time getting over jet lag. So in a situation like that, I've got a few big guns that I really help. Like I will use a high dose melatonin, say 3 milligrams. I'll use 400 to 600 milligrams of phosphatidylserine. These are things that you're using to force yourself to sleep when you don't want to sleep. Because sleep is really just a balancing act between 3 things: melatonin, adenosine, and cortisol. And we have ways to kind of manipulate all of those. Interesting.
Yeah. I've used melatonin, magnesium tea. I don't know if that makes a difference. And sometimes CBD, I found to be helpful. But and when you say get the room dark, I mean, you talk about actually like putting tape on, little lights on electronics, or how far do you go?
Yeah. So it depends. Like back when I sort of partially lived in New York, it was more of a problem, right? Because, I had to get like really special blackout blinds and stuff. Otherwise it was just like light all the time. Where we are now in Austin, Texas, we're kind of in the middle of nowhere. Like we don't have blinds on our windows, and that's okay. There's a little bit of, light that comes in, but you'd be amazed at how bright people's rooms are sometimes when they're sleeping. I do have a clock beside my bed, but it's on a very low setting and it's kind of faced away. Like I can't really see it, but I do, if I get up at some point, I kind of like to know what time it is. So yeah, I'm not fanatical about this. Like I don't wear an eye mask unless I'm on an airplane or in a hotel, and I can't, like, sometimes in a hotel I just can't get it dark enough. I'll use an eye mask.
Yeah. I got an Oura ring about a year ago, and that has helped me quite a bit, largely because I think the most profound impact was just seeing how much my heart rate was elevated by drinking alcohol. And also late dinners and consistency of bedtime was something I hadn't been tuned into. And the adjustment that I made is I used to allocate 8 hours for the sleeping process. I now allocate 9 because I realize that I'm often 15 minutes late. It takes me 15 minutes to actually fall asleep. And what I've concluded is if I want to get 8 hours of sleep a night, I need to allocate 9. And how do you feel about sleep trackers for your patients?
I think they're valuable, but also you have to be a little careful that you don't get too neurotic about them. So we are pretty liberal with sleep tracker holidays when that becomes a bit of a problem. So they're good in that they help us see what's going on. So we have a portal that allows us to see our patients' data. But I think the most powerful benefit is the one you just described. Actually, it's a bit of a compliance tool, and it's a bit of a reminder. Like I woke up today and my heart rate was 10 beats per minute higher. My HRV was 50% lower because I had 2 glasses of wine last night, and which I don't regret, by the way. One of my best friends from high school was over. I haven't seen him in 10 years. We had an awesome night, and our wives hung out, and we hung out, and it was a great time. But I got a little reminder. Hey, that's what happens when you do that. And would I do it again? Of course I would. Would I do that every night? Absolutely not.
Yeah. So of all the data, I joke with friends that I have a file called Scientific Studies That Support the Life I Want to Live Anyway. And I think we all have some degree of confirmation bias when we're digesting kind of health information. And for me, the most, 10 to 15 years ago, there was a broad perception. I remember reading an article in the New York Times that, 1 to 2 drinks a night for someone of my body weight decreased, heart disease risk by 33%. I had it framed and on the wall. I mean, not literally, but in my mind, it was like, I was like, hallelujah. This is like, so I was in a rhythm of 2 glasses of red wine every night. And then I just, kept getting this. More and more data was coming in, more and more studies just showing that really any consumption of alcohol had negative impacts. And so I have been very diligent in looking for any kind of countervailing evidence because honestly, I love a glass of wine or bourbon, and the only thing I like better than 1 glass of wine is 2 glasses of wine. And so I have cut back meaningfully. I've now cut back to like only when friends are over, only with company, because we know that that's critical to health, right? That human connection is critical. And so I guess my rationalization in my mind is, here are my 2 justifications, and you can poke holes in them. The first is that yes, alcohol is a toxin, but so is excessive stress. Cortisol in the bloodstream is like Drano, and if you have and arguably it's the lesser toxin if it really meaningfully decreases your stress throughout your week is my rationalization number 1. Rationalization number 2 is we know there are massive health benefits to really connecting deeply with other humans. And there's we had a guy named Edward Slingerland on the show who wrote a wonderful book called Drunk about the coevolution of humans and alcohol. Fascinating if you haven't read it. And he cited a number of studies showing, very definitively something that most people wouldn't be surprised by, which is you take a random sampling of people. Some think they're drinking alcohol, but they're not. Some think they're not drinking alcohol, but they are. Tested every which way. You get 5 strangers in a room, and there is way more human connection, more eye contact, more laughter, more trust when people, whether they realize it or not, have consumed alcohol. So I think it is effective in helping humans connect, and we know that's good for health. So what do you think?
I think I would be hard pressed to disagree with anything that you've said. I think it comes back down to this discussion of nuance again. And for everyone, there's going to be a slightly different answer to this question. So there are probably, at least in the case of red wine, there are probably also some phytochemical benefits as well. There's probably some antioxidant properties of red wine that in and of itself, from a nutrient standpoint, are probably beneficial. Everything you've said about the pro-social side of it for many people is true. But of course, for some people, that's not true. Let's not forget that there are many people for whom alcohol is a bad thing. So it's an antisocial
of course.
thing. Yeah. And there's a negative consequence of that, both to others and to themselves. So I don't want to lose sight of that. What's unambiguous is that ethanol per se is a toxin, a carcinogen, and a harmful molecule. So ethanol is the fourth macronutrient. We have fats, proteins, carbohydrates, and ethanol. Those are the four macronutrients. I just want to make sure everybody understands there's nothing about ethanol as a macronutrient, as a hydrocarbon, that is at any dose beneficial. It's not a linear response to toxicity. It's probably more exponential. So meaning at low doses, it's probably, the difference between between 0 tequilas and 1 tequila is not going to be huge, but 1 to 2 is going to be more, and 2 to 3 is going to be even more than that. And then with red wine, you have this other issue where there may in fact be some chemical benefits of the other constituents of the alcohol, i.e. distinct from the ethanol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then of course there's everything that you said, right, about the benefits of what it does and how that's probably what the epidemiology is capturing, right? The epidemiology is probably mostly capturing the social connection piece of it. So then how do you bring this back and reconcile this, which is, well, we just figured something out thanks to our sleep trackers, right? Which is, if I have 2 glasses of wine at 6 p.m. and go to bed at 10 p.m., I sleep pretty well.
Yeah.
If I have 2 glasses of wine at 9 p.m. and go to bed at 11 p.m., I sleep really poorly. Well, I mean, there's a pretty obvious implication here.
Yes.
Which
is
right. You can be mindful about how you use this thing to your advantage with that, and sort of shield yourself from some of the harm of it. And so to me, that's like what I would call sort of the nuanced approach to that.
Yeah. This is expert middle-aged partying, which is start early, right?
That's exactly right.
One of the things that we learn. And actually, like an open question is, how much of the negative impacts of alcohol on our health is due to negative impact on sleep, right? Because we know that negative impact on sleep has profound negative impacts, right? So I don't know how, when we look at those studies, how we can tease those two things apart.
I don't think there is a way retrospectively. I've talked about this with some folks who are kind of interested in this question as I am, and I think the only thing we've ever been able to come up with is you would have to study this question prospectively to really tease apart these different things. I don't know who would fund such a study, but there's no question in my mind we could really make, if an entity was willing to put up the money to do a 5-year study, we could really get some insights here.
I think you might. I know you sometimes find funding to accelerate studies of collective interest. I think there are enough people who enjoy a couple glasses of red wine that that there might be appetite to fund that. I was interested. I listened to your conversation with Dr. Andrew Huberman, and I was interested in his. He made the comment that he's never enjoyed drinking, and clearly when he encounters a data point that drinking is just categorically bad, he just fully accepts it and integrates it into his. Whereas since you do enjoy a glass or two of red wine, I mean, it seems to me that in a world within which we never have total clarity on the facts, and we're constantly building a point of view and a belief system, that a little bit of confirmation bias is perfectly natural, right?
Yeah.
That we're right. How do you feel
No, and
about
it's
that?
really funny. Like, I didn't drink in high school. I can count the number of times I drank, in college, med school a little bit more. But even then, it was just dumb drinking, right? It was like, cheap beer at the bowling alley kind of crap. But I've never really, like, it's it's only in the last 10 years that I've really come to enjoy alcohol for the sake of like what I'm drinking, like really kind of getting into tequila, really getting into mezcal, really getting into, a handful of mixed drinks that my wife claims I make better than any bar she's ever been to. Obviously certain types of wine, there's a couple of beers I really like that are unfortunately too expensive and too hard to come by. So you're right. Like I think maybe I would love to. I'm always looking for data to make me feel better about that. But truthfully, I haven't come up with a lot.
Yeah. I love your comment though, that if you have a sip of a glass of wine or something, it doesn't taste good, you'll spit it out.
I did it 2 nights ago or three nights ago. We opened a bottle that we had never tried before. So it was just like, hey, this kind of came recommended, opened it. And it wasn't like it was bad, but I drank it and I was like, I don't love this. I know we just spent $40 on this bottle, but it kind of sucks. Like, let's pitch it.
Yeah. I've found myself doing that with a croissant. That, I figure like it's really not something I should be eating, but if it's just totally transcendent and I break out in goosebumps from the joy, I'll give myself permission for certain kinds of experiences. But sometimes you bite into something and it's just stale and not so good, and I think, why am I chewing on this? This is coming out.
That's my approach to gelato in Italy. It's like it's so good. I'm going to have it twice a day, every day for 2 weeks, and deal with the consequences when I get home.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, this is a good segue to nutrition. And you say, Peter, that you hate being asked at dinner parties about diet. Why is that?
I also hate being asked about it on podcasts, by the way. No, I just hate the topic. I hate everything about it. And that's it's sort of a mean thing to say. The truth of it is, there's a lot of times people come up to me and ask me things at parties, and there's just a genuine confusion and curiosity, and I can understand that. But what I think I rail against is just, again, the sort of, and social media has made this unbearable, but it's just the religious zeal with which people try to tell you that their diet is the one true diet. And again, the evidence is just overwhelming that is not the case. And nutrition matters in terms of energy balance. Nutrition matters as far as micronutrients. Nutrition matters as far as anabolic building blocks, i.e. protein. Nutrition matters, in terms of avoidance of, disease-causing agents. Like there are some really obvious things about nutrition that matters. Truthfully, the only thing that's not in the book about that, because as much as I hate to talk about nutrition, it does have 2 enormous chapters in the book. So I have a lot to say about it, even though it's not a topic I enjoy. The only thing I didn't include in that, just because time and space became unyielding, was I do have a very growing interest in soil and plant quality.
Interesting.
And sort of, the cycle of life, right? So what's the carbon cycle, right? So if your soil sucks, which unfortunately most of the soil in the US now officially sucks, then your plants kind of suck. The nutrient density of the plant sucks. If the nutrient density of the plant sucks, the animal nutrient density that eats it sucks. So that doesn't really matter that much if you're going to, be a vegetarian or an omnivore. You're just not getting optimal quality. And this is actually the thing I'm finding myself most interested in now, is understanding this world of regenerative agriculture and understanding how soil quality can have such a profound impact. And, we have a garden here at our house, and I just can't get over the difference in how, and unfortunately it's not big enough that we can sustain ourselves fully on it. So we're still kind of going back and forth between, the best organic stuff we could buy versus our stuff. And it's night and day different. Like the tomatoes that, my son grows in our garden are incredible. And the stuff we buy in the store, even though it's the the organic stuff, which I think is better than the inorganic stuff, or inorganic, non-organic. So like if I had a second life, I'd love to have a regenerative, ag farm where everything from soil to animal is purely grown in this way. And, so to me, that's the most interesting topic in nutrition right now. But at the level of kind of our patients, what are we trying to do? We're trying to make sure people are in energy balance. So if you're overnourished, we got to make you less nourished. That's just a polite way of saying you have too much fat in your body. And a lot of it is probably in the subcutaneous space, which isn't problematic other than the obvious aesthetic component that people care about. But it's when it escapes that subcutaneous area and it starts to, coalesce around organs as visceral fat, within the muscle as intramuscular fat, around the pancreas, the heart, all these other places. That really metabolically toxic fat is a very high priority for us to get rid of. And so we juxtapose that question with, are you under-muscled or adequately muscled? And most people show up slightly overnourished and under-muscled. So this is the big problem. That's the majority of people that are listening to us right now. You're overnourished, but you're under-muscled. So you have to reduce intake while increasing protein intake and increasing strength training. That's the solution to that problem. More strength training, more protein, less calories. And it's hard.
I imagine, as you say, there's a lot of tribal passion around diets and nutrition. One of the you talk a lot in the book about fats and how the body processes them and cholesterol, and a lot of it was new information for me. This notion that for most all people listening, I imagine the word cholesterol has a negative connotation. There's obviously people talk about good and bad, which are distinctions you don't love. But I think I had not understood that cholesterol is critical to the functioning of a healthy body, right? I believe it comprises our cell membranes, and that so fats are absolutely critical to our health. It's more complicated than we think, and you can have extra subcutaneous fat, as you were saying, effectively belly fat or wherever it resides, and still be perfectly healthy as long as that fat has not overflowed into your muscles, your bloodstream, your kidneys, right?
That's right.
You want to speak more to that?
No, you did a great job explaining it. The greatest evolutionary leapfrog we took probably came in one way or another in response to our ability to store excess energy. Yeah. So there's nobody that would dispute what distinguishes us from every other species on this planet is our brain, right? We're not bigger, we're not stronger, we're not faster. You can always find another species on this planet that is better than us at any domain you can think of except one. And so we pay a price to have this brain is one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is we paid the price by being able to store energy in order to have this brain. So, your brain is a fraction of your body weight, and yet it's responsible for 20 to 25% of your metabolic need. And that would be incompatible with our evolution had we not figured out how to store energy. So this capacity to put excess carbohydrate and excess fat into subcutaneous fat stores is the thing that made us what we are. And in a relatively food scarce environment, it poses zero problems. It only has posed a problem in a relatively recent time frame. I mean, it's like 0.00001% of our genetic past that this has become problematic because we're now in such a food dense environment. We have so much food availability, and when you factor in other factors that are working against us, so now we have unnatural light, which makes sleep much more difficult. We have modernity that has rendered activity optional. So everything is working against us. Chronic stress versus just acute stress. We used to be mostly about acute stress. Now we are mostly about chronic stress. So you have chronic stress, inactivity, poor sleep, abundant food, it's a catastrophe. So this idea that we can store adequate amounts of energy is out the window. Most of us are storing far more energy than we need. And at some point, it escapes as I describe it in the book, it escapes the bathtub that we are, that we have to house water in. And the water starts flowing out of the bathtub. And as long as the water's in the bathtub, everything's fine. Water starts leaving the bathtub, you're hosed, right? That's when it leaks into the ducts and screws up the air conditioning and, God knows where it ends up in the floors and stuff like that. So once that fat gets into those other places, that's where metabolic disease really escalates. I mean, that's what's happening in someone with type 2 diabetes. And that's why there's a very strong, though not complete, correlation between obesity and metabolic disease.
So you could have someone who had the right genetic predisposition and exercised quite a bit, who had a beer gut and yet was pretty healthy, like a sumo wrestler that trained quite a bit and had the right predisposition.
Yeah,
is that true?
There are people, and by the way, it's about. I mean, there's a figure in the book on it, so I can't remember the exact numbers, but roughly, I think it's maybe 25% of people who are obese are metabolically healthy, and their health outcomes are no different than a non-obese person. Similarly, about I can't remember the numbers again. I think it's 10% of people who are non-obese, and in fact, not just non-obese, but of normal BMI, are metabolically unhealthy. Their health outcomes, paradoxically, are slightly worse than the obese, metabolically unhealthy individual. These are people that have really small bathtubs. In other words, they don't have much capacity to store excess energy, so they very quickly start to vault it into these unwanted places.
And I love this detail that when we eat fats, that typically our bodies produce cholesterol, produce fats, but that most of the fats that we eat are shat out or are not
cholesterol, not fat.
Cholesterol. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Most of the cholesterol that we eat, because it is attached to another chemical group called an ester link, it's just too big to fit in the transporter in the gut that brings it into the cell. So, the cholesterol that's in eggs or shellfish or things like that, it's just leaving. Yeah, it's leaving your body without ever entering it. So virtually all of the cholesterol in our body is there because our cells have made it.
So the basic principles, though, of nutrition that are non-controversial, I imagine, are avoid drinking sugar water, right? Obviously, like, sodas, but even fruit juice, Gatorade, sports drinks, like sugar water is kind of all over the place. Processed foods are generally a bad idea. Would you agree with that? What do you think are the non-controversial statements?
Well, I mean, again, I don't want to be like too much of a stickler, but even the term processed food is a bit complicated, right? Because processing food is what allows us to live in the way that we live, right? Like it would be very difficult for us to live if we could only subside on completely unprocessed food, because we're not all growing our own food. So it's true that if you're eating something processed, the probability that it's bad is probably higher than the probability that it's good. But look, there were some processed things that I eat that I think are really healthy. Yeah. So you have to sort of look at everything in a case by case basis. So if we're looking for just broad contours, it's all the common sense things for sure. It's shopping on the outside of the grocery store, not the inside. It's, always doing the grandma test. Like, did my grandma eat this? If no, I probably shouldn't be eating this. But again, that's not a universal truth, right? Your grandma couldn't have had a whey protein shake, but there's really high quality whey protein out there that is a great way to get additional protein if you can't get it through all of your meals. So long-winded way of saying, one has to be painting and not painting by numbers when it comes to nutrition, I think.
Yeah. And so fasting, I've been in the intermittent fasting, time restricted eating, eating within an 8-hour window plan for 4 years now. You are kind of, it seems like uncertain that is the right path.
Well, I just think it's one of the 3 strategies we have for energy restriction. So if we go back to the framework, are you overnourished or undernourished? If you're in the overnourished camp, regardless of what's going on in the undermuscled or overmuscled or adequately muscled, you're going to be reducing intake. You have 3 strategies to do that. Time restriction is one of them. Time restriction has the advantage of being conceptually and operationally the easiest one to implement.
Yeah, yeah.
It is a mindless hack, okay? You literally just need a clock. That's it. And once you do it, it's so easy. So that's the good news. Here's the bad news. The bad news is it's very difficult with a very tight window of time-restricted feeding to get the appropriate amount of protein consumed and spread out accordingly over the course of the day. The second big limitation of time-restricted feeding, which is, by the way, I'm not suggesting that you're doing this, but just this is a lot of people do this, is they tend to overcompensate when they are eating by just eating a bunch of crap.
Yeah.
Look, you see the same thing in everything. You know, the person who says, I'm going keto or I'm going vegan, therefore I'm holy and anointed, and they just eat the crap version of keto and vegan, right? So it's like, congratulations, you've done nothing. So those are the 2 biggest issues we have to be mindful of when people do time-restricted feeding. And there are ways around both of these things. But again, you just have to be mindful and you have to be very deliberate about it.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, as you say, it was much easier and much more appealing than other ways of restricting my diet. It caused me to drop another 10 pounds to get closer to my college weight. And I feel much more alert. I used to feel kind of a little sleepy after lunch. Generally, I like the cognitive feeling of it. And it also lowered my LDL into a healthy range. So it seems to have worked for me. However, I am concerned, having read your book, that I'm not eating enough protein. And this is one of the most surprising sections of your nutrition chapters. As you say, the standard recommendations for protein are a joke, right? So you're recommending 2 to 3 times, I think, the standard protein consumption recommendations.
Yeah, about 2 to 2.5 times. So the standard, the RDA, which is the God, now I'm blanking. We're gonna have to edit this out. What is RDA? It's recommended dietary.
Recommended daily allowance, is it?
It's dietary.
Dietary
it's not daily.
Okay.
Okay, I'll try that again.
Yeah.
So the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance for protein, is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So if you do the math on that, so someone who weighs 80 kilograms, they'd be, recommending 65 grams of protein. So that's, woefully ineffective, right? That's enough to not waste away if you were, starving on a shipwreck. But the reality of it is, if we're talking about putting on muscle mass and maintaining muscle mass, especially as we age, and as you age, you encounter something called anabolic resistance, where, as the name suggests, just as we have insulin resistance, where the muscles are less sensitive to the effects of insulin, the muscles also become less sensitive to the available amino acids to undergo what's called muscle protein synthesis, which is the process of assimilating and incorporating those amino acids into growth. So if you look at the data, it's clear you need probably closer to 1.6 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So that 80 kilo person who weighs about 175 pounds, if you convert it, is going to need closer to 160 grams of protein. So, I just basically say whatever system you're in, it's either about 1 gram per pound of body weight or about 2 grams per kilo of body weight. And that's going to get you in the right zone. And then it's not just that in total amount, it's that those have to be spread out reasonably. So you can't have too much and you can't have too little protein in one sitting, or you reduce the effectiveness of it. So if you're consuming probably less than 10 to 15 grams of protein in a sitting, you're not getting any of the anabolic benefits of that protein. That protein is first, the liver always takes first dibs on the protein and will undergo gluconeogenesis. So it's going to turn that first spigot of protein into glucose. And so you have to be kind of above and beyond that. So if you just, ate 10 grams,
interesting,
16 times a day, you wouldn't get the anabolic benefits. You'd get some, but you wouldn't get much. Similarly, if you ate it all in one day, all in one sitting, the data would suggest that you can really only use about 40 or 50 grams in one sitting. So you have to kind of spread that out.
Interesting. And this is part of the challenge with intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating, which is you say, for me at 185 pounds to get to the recommended protein levels, I'd need to have 4 servings of
45 grams.
Of 45 grams, which is 6 ounces of chicken, fish, or meat. That's a lot to consume. And if you look at what that looks like, I just looked it up because I was so astonished by these numbers. A cup of hummus contains about 19 grams of protein. A cup of almonds, about 28 grams of protein, which, by the way, is very expensive, almonds. And so we're talking about like 9 cups of hummus to hit my numbers.
You want to be mindful of, especially if you're trying to cut calories while you're doing this, like you have to look at basically pure sources of protein. Like I would never use hummus as a protein source because it's just coming with way too many other calories.
Interesting.
When I'm consuming protein, I want to consume the leanest source of protein I can get. So for me, it's mostly venison, elk, bison, salmon. I mean, that's where I'm getting the bulk of my protein. And so I'll easily have, like when we're done this podcast, I'm going to go and have 50 grams of venison, of protein in the form of venison, and the total calories will be 250.
And so you would say that it's possible to get there to as a vegetarian or a vegan. It's just difficult.
That's right. Yeah, it's just harder because of protein quality. So protein density and protein quality are lower without animal products.
And these protein levels are critical to building the muscle, which we've described how critical that is to long-term health.
Yep.
Okay. Quick side question for you, Peter. Might you have an extra 5 or 10 minutes or a hard stop? Do you have a hard stop in 6 minutes?
Maybe another 5. So maybe 11 minutes. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, great. Because I've got two final topics I'm excited about. Okay, great. So I have had a real interest in longevity research, and I read Lifespan by David Sinclair. And what do you think about his information theory of aging? And I know you're not a big fan of the NAD booster, NR, NMN supplements. What's your view of the probability that we will meaningfully extend the human lifespan in the next several decades?
I guess it depends what we define as meaningful, but if we're talking about basically undoing aging, I'm not particularly optimistic that that's something that's going to happen in our lifetime.
And what do you think of this sort of notion that aging results from an accumulation of errors in our genetic code? This information theory of aging, this notion that our when our cells reproduce, the error rate and our ability to correct errors in cellular reproduction, as I understand it, erode as we get older. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, absolutely. It's a well understood hallmark of aging. So there are 9 hallmarks of aging that are well described, and clearly a subset of these involve replication errors and accumulation of mutations. Another one of them involves epigenetic modification to the genes, even absent mutations, and that just is what happens when you get what are called methyl groups, so little carbons with 3 hydrogens on them stuck onto the DNA itself, and that impacts the expression of those genes. So you have both accumulation of mutations, and then you have epigenetic overwriting of the genes. And these are both clearly a factor in our aging. I don't think that's in dispute. I think where I probably differ in my level of optimism from maybe the most optimistic here is I think that's a much harder problem to solve than maybe is advertised. So there's a very famous idea proposed by a scientist, Yamanaka, who I believe was awarded the Nobel Prize for this. So using these Yamanaka factors, there are 4 of these factors, and you can basically turn a cell back into its primordial stem cell by adding in the 4 Yamanaka factors. The problem with this approach, when applied to an organism as complicated as ourselves, is, one, it's not clear how you would apply the factors across the body, right? It's clearly not like an ointment you're going to rub on yourself. You somehow have to decide which cells, like, well, is it the heart? Do we want to somehow take a heart which is aging and has less ejection fraction, less contractile function than it had, when you were 20, and we want to take it and make it become younger again? So how would we even get the Yamanaka factors into the heart? Secondly, how do we know where to tell it to stop? Because I don't want to turn your cardiac myocyte into a stem cell, because, that's not going to work out too well. How do I even know it's going to differentiate back into the cardiac myocyte that we want it to be? So I think that there are going to be some applications for this type of approach. One obvious example might be with cartilage. Can we take a person whose cartilage is, very much in the phenotype of an arthritic state, and can we, using localized therapy, try to bring that back to something that is a more youthful phenotype? Again, I'm still not convinced that a Yamanaka factor is the way to do this, for reasons that are probably too complicated for the podcast. But anyway, I could say more about this, but I think this is a very long and interesting topic. But I think, sure.
And in terms of the supplements that you yourself take, I know rapamycin is one that you are taking. Are there any other supplements that you're personally taking in this area of life extension?
Well, Rapa is actually a drug. It's not a supplement. So it's, and it's, it's important to understand that this is a very off-label use of rapamycin and Rapamune. And this is not something that we use liberally. Most of our patients are not taking rapamycin. I would argue that I'm really taking a leap of faith in using rapamycin. I've been doing it for 5 years. But the unfortunate thing with rapamycin in this situation, which is taking it as a geroprotective agent. So geroprotective meaning you're taking this not to target a specific disease, but to target those hallmarks of aging that I referred to earlier. The real problem with rapamycin and many proposed geroprotective agents is you don't have any biomarkers for them. And you got to think, it's really complicated in biology to take drugs where you don't have biomarkers. At least if you're taking something to lower your lipids, you have your lipids to look at. If you're taking something to lower your blood pressure, you can see your blood pressure. If you're taking something to improve your blood glucose, you can measure your blood glucose. When we give people rapamycin, when I take it myself, I don't have a biomarker to point to. So that's the challenge with the hallmarks of aging, is we don't have great biomarkers for them. And even things like methylation clocks at this point seem so noisy, so invalidated, that they don't seem to offer any insight meaningfully in predicting what matters most, which is remaining life. Now, I'm actually optimistic that that's going to change. So I do think that is the next frontier, is being able to use epigenetic markings as a way to come up with a better biomarker for these types of interventions. So that is something that I think is going to happen in our lifetime. And that's something I'm very excited about.
Yeah. Let's turn to the last chapter in your book about mental health. And as you point out, all this effort to extend our lives and extend our health span is not particularly worthwhile if we're not enjoying our lives, right? And you do something really bold and I would say generous in your final chapter of the book, which is you share some really significant challenges you faced in your childhood and young adulthood, and talk about how you adapted to those challenges and the consequences in your adult life. Feel free to share as little of that journey as you'd like, or as much, but I think it's a really inspiring choice you made to get into your own journey with mental health and really helpful for readers and listeners.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, this is, of all the things I write about in the book, this is clearly the area where I have the least professional expertise. I think in the rest of the book, I'm bringing the reader along the journey as the teacher. And I think in the last chapter, I'm bringing the reader along as the student. We didn't spend much time on this podcast talking about the distinction between lifespan and health span.
Yeah.
But I think it's also intuitive to the listener what we mean by that. Lifespan is how long you live, and that's where we talk a lot about the horseman, and the horseman being a threat to your lifespan. And of course, implicitly, we've touched on health span, which is the quality of your life. That's so much about what we talk about in the marginal decade. And it's also inevitable that gravity is working against us in everything that we've just said, right? Your risk of dying is increasing with every passing year, regardless of how much of this stuff you do. If you follow all of these steps, I think you'll live a longer life, but maybe it's a decade longer. It's not like you're doubling your lifespan, and it's certainly not that you're going to become immortal. The only thing that doesn't have to decline with age is your emotional health. And I do distinguish this from mental health, right? I mean, this is, mental health really is more about the pathology around, depression, anxiety, mental health diseases like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, things like that, personality disorders. But I think emotional health is a broader term that encompasses mental health, but basically speaks to pathology and not pathology. So everyone really should have a dashboard of their emotional health. And I think it is the single most important piece of this whole puzzle. And even though it only gets 1 out of 17 chapters in the book, it's a very important chapter because, as you said, without this, nothing else matters. You see, there are people who are in a wheelchair whose mind is sharp as a tack and live a very meaningful life. They might not be able to physically do all the things they could do before they were in a wheelchair, but they can have a wonderfully rich, meaningful life. And there's, conversely, many people who have complete sound mind, complete sound body, and they are miserable as hell. And their life sucks, and their relationships suck. And I would argue I was one of those people. And so in that sense, this is a chapter about how to address that crisis and why I think it's the best news of all. Because as we're kind of all going through this journey, basically just dying, because that's what we're doing. I mean, we're all just dying. This is the one thing where we can become better as we age. We can become better people as we move through life. And even as we're getting weaker and slower and dumber.
Yeah. And some of your discontent in your early life was motivating and drove you, right, to have the level of intensity. I mean, your podcast is called Drive, right, to have this incredible
Although it is in reference to driving, like it's the drive, like going for a drive.
Okay.
But you're not the first person to assume that. Yeah.
Okay, right. But it's how do you think about optimal contentment? Right? Because when you look back at your own life, your success is inextricably entwined with your, childhood and young adult experience, which drove you to prove yourself and this kinds of extrinsic motivation of proving yourself to the world. Now, as we get older, we hope to be more driven by intrinsic motivation and do things for ourselves and families and communities opposed to prove something, right? But clearly that driver was critical to getting you to where you are. How do you think about optimal contentment?
Not sure. I don't look at my past as necessarily a negative thing. It is what it is. I think the only regret I have is that I didn't figure out sooner a way to extract the positive things from my experiences from the negative ones, right? So there are many adaptations that come from negative experiences. I had a lot of really positive adaptations. You point them out. but I had a lot of negative ones too. And I'm only in the last, 5 or 6 years coming to the point where I'm now focusing on how to undo those negative ones and try to preserve some of the positive ones. I wish I could have done that 20 years sooner. I wish I could have done that 30 years sooner. There's a lot of there are a lot of dead bodies in my wake, and I wish there were none.
Well, it's an inspiring chapter, and I'm sure will be one of the many parts of your book that has a profound, large-scale positive impact. Peter, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule, your workout routine, your thriving practice, and your book tour to be with us. I now have a lot of work to do. I got to fill up my sandbags in my rucking sack. I got to hit the trainer at the gym. And I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for making the time to read the book. It was it's clear you've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I appreciate it.